And it is totally my pleasure to present to you Lars Svanstrom.
I shall start telling you that I'm not that grumpy as I look in the photo.
Now, close to the mic.
Oh, close to the mic. Is it on?
Yes.
Yeah, I should say that I'm not that grumpy as I look in the photograph at the end.
I complain.
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, you might ask why a Swede would write a book about the Day of the Dead together with the museum at Norröf in Stockholm. It happens so that the Museum of Ethnography in Stockholm has quite a long history of contact with Mexico. Several of the curators of Americas in the museum have studied here, making their doctorates here and so on. And there was actually a small event about the Day of the Dead started at the museum already in the late 60s. And when my wife Christina moved to Sweden in late 80s, we started to collaborate with the museum, and the event of Day of the Dead became quite a large one in the 80s, 90s, and still is. So, sort of in the late 90s, the curator of Americas, Staffan Brunius, and I started to talk about writing a book about the Day of the Dead. He actually had studied, he made a master's degree of anthropology, studying beekeeping among the Maya Indians in Yucatan at some university in the USA, I don't remember which. So we decided we should write a book. We said that I put up the photos, Staffan Brunius writes the text, and we print in 6 months. And that took 6 years. And we weren't lazy during these 6 years, I can promise. So, you might have been, many of you here in San Miguel a long time, you have seen this kind of images in San Miguel, this kind of sort of monumental, large-scale offerings, honoring different people, different things. And you might have seen this kind of offering here in remembrance of a dead journalist, or dead journalist, murdered journalist. So it's not only nowadays remembering dead persons, there are also some social context, political context that you can see in an offering on the Day of the Dead, in this public manifestation. Or you can see these sort of more carnivalesque images, which is a very new thing. There was a lady, last time I made this presentation, that afterwards told me she was very disappointed because she thought this kind of Katrina parade was a 100-year-old tradition, or several 100-year-old tradition. It's not. It might be 10 years or something. Well, or you might have been at a graveyard, as is a sort of very intimate family moment, where in this case, this is outside Toluca, this woman and the daughters mourning their dead father, his husband, of course. Or this kind of, what I would say, the original kind of Day of the Dead, when we talk historic times, the small offering in a little house here in Tlahuelompa in Puebla. So, what you can see here, there is, well, when you start, I should go back a moment. There is quite a range there here of manifestations of the Day of the Dead. You have a nearly carnivalesque one, you have this public square offerings, you have kind of fine art manifestations in galleries and museums. You have the conservative manifestations, often a very sort of communal activity in indigenous villages where everybody works together to create this. So there are some obvious questions, of course, from where does it come? Does it have an indigenous heritage? Is it of Catholic origin? Is it both? How did it start? How did it evolve? So, when we started to research this, we soon found that we didn't find the information we needed in the literature available. We thought we were going to do that, but we couldn't find it. So we had to decide that we had to go back to the very early ethnohistory written by Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, by Fray Duran, and others that started to write about things already in the mid-1500s, mid-16th century. Later on, so Staffan Brunius is an extremely academic person. He put up some very strict rules for this. We should have 3 sources for everything we said, everything we wrote. Of course, in the beginning, we don't have that. There are 2 or 3, 4 sources from the second half of the 16th century, which is Sahagún, Duran, and a couple of codices. In the 17th century, 18th century, we start to have travelers, priests that are writing about these things, and of course 19th century, quite a lot more, and from the 20th century onwards, then quite a lot of information, but not the kind of information we wanted. When we started to study this, we did find, and I think I did translate this to Spanish, we found some very sort of different opinions. I take it in English. The dean of the university in Mexico City said that the university students offer us their interpretation of a profound and millennial tradition of the Mexicans, the cult of the dead. So it's millennial, far beyond the Aztecs, and it's profound, the cult of the dead. Sorry. While the Dr. Elsa Malvido, historian, working in the Institute of History and Anthropology of Mexico, says that the sugar skull, the bread with bones, the offering, visits to graveyards are of Catholic origin. They have nothing indigenous and were politically reinvented with Mexican folklore in the 30s. So that's quite a range here. So if we go back to the pre-Hispanic times, there are 2 things that are important if we look at the, shall we say, religious or traditional platform that was existing when the Spaniards came in the beginning of the 16th century. The first one, the creation. You might know that when, according to the Aztec myth of creation, the universe, or the sun as they call them, has been destroyed. 4 suns have been destroyed, and they were living in the 5th sun. That was created by the gods that united, they came together at Teotihuacan. They threw themselves into a holy fire, and then the sun rose again, the 5th sun. But still no people. So then Quetzalcoatl went down into the underworld, into Mictlan, which was an extremely dangerous travel. But he managed to convince Mitlantecutli that he could bring some bones of an earlier human race up to the earth, which he did. And there he offered his own blood on these bones. And then this new human race was born that later became the Aztecs. So this new race was born with a guilt to the gods, and that was blood. And the Aztecs took on the task to fulfill this need for blood of the gods. So if they stopped this offering of blood, the universe would disappear, the sun would disappear, the 5th sun would go under. So death became the origin of life, which is one important issue here in the sort of traditional religious platform I'm talking about. The other one, life after, sorry. Oh, didn't I switch? Oh, I didn't switch image, sorry. It's a mess. This is what I should have, you should have seen when I talked about the creation. I see both here, which is a problem. Okay, I'm learning. So, the next one, life after death. Where people came after dying depended on how they died. An active, violent death, painful death was very good. Then they could come to one of the upper levels, And they could even come towards the Ikantonatjö Inuit cattle, the sky that is the home of the sun. That was the best place. To that place came warriors dead in battle and women that had died in childbirth. So the warriors did lift the sun up to the highest point in the morning, and the women took the sun down in the afternoon. That was their job. Others that had had prestigious deaths had other roles. They could make rain, they could make thunder, so they had different roles here. So the living depended on the dead also. The dead wasn't gone, they still had a role to play in the continuation of the daily life. So you had to keep them happy. There is actually, we jump a little bit here, there is an interesting example in Oaxaca where people, and the Day of the Dead, that can be up to 9 days, that people are venerated on certain days according to their way of dying. And they recently added a new day for people that have been killed on the highway. So that is not the 2nd of November nor the 1st, it's late October. In very conservative indigenous villages. So, remember to change. Now this is an offering in Mexico City, but it's a good representation of the daily life of the Aztecs. And when I say Aztecs, what happened here is that Aztecs are the people who were most studied by these early writers in mid-16th century. But in the whole Mesoamerica there were similar kind of religious frameworks. So even if Aztecs became a bit of the spokespersons for the Mesoamerican Indians, their traditions sort of spread out over whole Mesoamerica. People were very strictly governed by a ceremonial calendar of 18 months, ceremonial months, and 5 forgettable days, and a montaigne, that was horrible. You shouldn't leave your house these days. So 18 months of 20 days each. 5 of these 18 months include important ceremonies to the dead, in remembrance of the dead. And they are offerings of flowers. There is no mention of cempasúchil, the yellow flower, as that flower. It's all kinds of flowers. They offered arrows, food, amaranth bread, bread made of amaranth seeds, in human forms. And these were so important, so the Spaniards did forbid the growing, the planting of amaranth immediately after conquest. They also offered tamales. There was singing and there were ceremonies both in homes and in temples and public areas. I can see the next one, we can see there were, of these 18 months, 5 were very important. You have Tlaxochimaco, that was called the small feast of the dead, Chocolhuetzi, the big feast for the dead, Tepehuitl, the feast of the mountains, the number 14, Quecholi, that was in late October, beginning of November, and was the biggest of them all. And you had in January, February, Iscali, the recreation. And you can see one interesting thing here, that these follows to the extent the agricultural cycle. So these 18 months were very much connected to the agricultural cycle. Another very important month was in early May. I don't remember his name, and that was dedicated to the planting. And one of the key anthropologists studied these things, I don't remember her name at this moment, writing about a very, very strong connection with the agricultural cycle, and the Day of the Dead has this connection with Quecholi. And the other pole of this is La Fiesta de la Cruz, the 3rd of May, as the planting feast. Okay, so then comes the conquest. And the conquest was carried out very efficiently, very violently, no remorse. Absolutely, they thought absolutely that they had the moral right, based on their Catholic faith, to do anything they needed to conquer Mexico from a military and religious standpoint. It didn't matter how many they killed or not. Then the elite of Spanish missionaries were sent over here. So the elite level of the indigenous religion was destroyed. The temples were destroyed. But there was also first very inclusive approach to Indian traditions and the Indians. For example, there was a school, a university, we call it El Colegio Tlatelolco, created in order to educate the sons of the earlier Aztec elite. And they were even supposed to be ordinated as priests, which they later retracted from and didn't permit. But there was, and even there were talks about using Nahuatl as the language in New Spain. So there was definitely kind of support for a syncretism between the Catholic faith and the indigenous religions. And there are several examples of that. One of them, most well known, is Fray Pedro de Gante, who included dances in the Mass in order to bring the Indians to the Mass. And he writes specifically of that he permitted indigenous dancing in relation to the Mass to make them come. Now, if we think about that, the elite level of religion was destroyed, but on the family level, death and the dead are mostly a family issue. So it's very probable that traditions related to death and to the dead continue in this family context, below the sort of elite level that was destroyed. Also, the agricultural cycle is very important in the family context. They depend very strongly on that. So that's most probably so that traditions in the family level related to death, agricultural cycle, did continue. And then, so we have here two religions that are confronting each other. The very deeply rooted indigenous traditions on the family level still, and the Catholicism on the sort of elite level. And there are a lot of similarities here. For example, to the left we have a drawing in one of the codices of a sacrifice of a person in relation to a fertility rite, which is not that different from the death of the holy Sebastian. I mean, if the Indians saw that, they could feel a bit at home. It's about the same thing. And there are all other similarities here. They had an upper and lower world, hell and the sky, then heaven and hell. They had pilgrimages, they had religious centers, and they were also by the Spaniards a search for similarities in the early, after the conquest in the early 16th century. Quetzalcoatl was identified as Thomas the Apostle by the Spaniards. Tlaloc as Saint John the Baptist, Tonantzin as Virgin Mary and Virgen de Guadalupe. So there was a search for a similarity. We come back a little bit about that. So these indigenous beliefs became definitely integrated in the resulting Mexican Catholicism. So it's not far-fetched here to think that death being a family issue, the conquest having taken a very heavy toll among the Indians. Quechole, there's this festivity dedicated to the dead on 2 November. That came at the same time as All Souls Day, All Saints Day, and that slowly became moved and created a Day of the Dead later. The writer talked about, Johanna Broda writes quite about that, a lot about that, how the agricultural cycle and the religious cycle continued in the line. And very early, we can say here, again translated to Spanish, I thought there would be a lot of Mexicans here. Fray Diego Duran writes in 1570, when I asked why offerings are done on All Saints' Day, they told it was in honor of children, an old tradition that has survived. I then asked if offerings are also done on All Souls' Day, and the response was yes, in the honor of adults. I suspect the pagan feast has been moved to All Saints' Day to hide the old ceremony. So he saw something he didn't like here. And 20 years later, Fray Jerónimo de Mendieta writes that, and as the priest ordered them to make many crosses, they put their idols under or beneath the crosses. And under the false pretense that they worshipped the cross, they only worshipped the idols and demons they had hidden. So there is a very interesting book written about exactly that, called Idols Behind Altars by Anita Brenner, that writes about this as a continuous issue, that when churches were built, crosses were built, and so there were idols hidden there. If we go a bit further down the line here, this is an offering from the Mazatec region in Oaxaca. By the way, when there are no indication of who took the photographs, these are mine. When there are other photographers, I've indicated their name. Thomas Gage, that was a Dominican missionary, writes in 1630 that in his book Travels in the New World. So on the second day in November, that they call All Saints' Day, they are very foolish and superstitious, making offerings of food. And you might remember I told you about the early Aztec traditions about bread made by amaranth seeds with human forms, and here we have bread with human faces inclusive. In 1763, there is one writing that's very interesting, written by Fray Francisco de Acofrin, Franciscan friar. And he said, before the Day of the Dead, and this is the first time we've found the expression Day of the Dead used, in 1763. He calls it specifically Dia de Muertos. They sell thousands of small sheep of sugar that they call offering. They also sell coffins and images of the dead. So this starts to look very much what we can see still today. Another thing that happens in the 18th century is the appearance of a new movement, or shall we call it neo-Aztecism or something like that, where even Spanish priests started to look for a kind of cultural and even religious continuation from the pre-Hispanic time, pre-conquest time, up to that time. There were talks about, one did such cultural roots in the indigenous past and saw the conquest as a kind of pause or an unfortunate parenthesis in New Spain. Francisco Javier Clavijero, Jesuit priest, wrote in mid-1700s a book that is idealizing completely the Aztecs. They were Christians from the very beginning. And most importantly, Fray Servando Teresa de Mier, who in 1794 held a Guadalupe sermon in Mexico City, where he claimed that no mission was needed. The Aztecs and the Mesoamerican people in general were already Christians, just that they had venerated God under the name of Tezcatlipoca and Virgin Mary as Coatlique. And he had a similar comment about the Virgin Guadalupe, etc. He was obviously expelled from the country. After some years he came back and put in jail. But became later quite important in the independence movement. So there was a very strange intent here to try to connect culture, the glorious Aztec past with New Spain, and seeing the conquest as an unfortunate parenthesis. So, if we continue a bit in time here, these nice little sugar skulls, we have not seen a mention of them yet. But in 1826, there is a British captain, J.F. Lyon, and he travels around in Mexico, and he writes about that he saw something in marketplaces around the Day of the Dead, and he calls them nondescripts of sugar. Colorful nondescripts of sugar. And two persons from the British Museum, Elizabeth Carmichael and Claude Sayer, speculates that that could have been sugar skulls, which sounds quite reasonable. By the way, Claude Sayer wrote a chapter in our book also about the Day of the Dead. That's written in easy Swedish if somebody interested. There is also a number of other writers writing about the Day of the Dead in the 19th century. Paula Kolonitz, whom you might have heard about, Calderón de la Barca, that was married to Spain's first ambassador to Mexico. Fredrik Ober, Christian Sartorius writes about the Day of the Dead in 1800s. Now, we have to be aware also here that Mexico was not the only place where skulls, symbols of death and so on were important. We have the European traditions of memento mori, danse macabre, that also, of course, were imported to Mexico through the Spanish immigration. So you can't it's not only the indigenous past that can have influenced these traditions. And it's many people that investigated the work of Posada believes that he got his idea of the imagery from the memento mori images, and especially the enormously decorated catafalques that the Spanish elite used at their funerals. They were enormously, largely decorated to the degree that must have been in the 1700s, the vice king limited the number of candles a normal person could have on his catafalque. He could not have more than the governing elite. And there are also direct comments here. For example, George M. Foster mentions in his book Contest and Culture that the yellow flowers that now are seen as the flowers for the Day of the Dead, actually yellow flowers was used as for decorations of during funerals in Spain also, and music was used when burying dead children in Spain. And Hugo Weckmann, in his book The Herencia Medieval de Mexico, mentions that these calavera verses that are written about people, how they're going to die, what will happen to them, very funny little verses, actually is a tradition coming from Catalonia in Spain. Now, I mentioned that this public manifestation of the Day of the Dead that we see in the main square here in San Miguel, that it's a kind of new thing, offerings out on the street. There are some, this is not entirely correct. In the 1800s, at the main square in Mexico City, the Zócalo, the 19th century to the end of 19th century, there was enormous festivities going on during the Day of the Dead on that square and in the Alameda Park. You had concerts and theater in the Alameda Park, and the main square was a place for meet people, to see and to be seen. There was they charge entrance fee to get into El Zócalo and to Alameda at these days. It was financed by the shop owners around the square. And there was a sort of a building, a provisorial building built on the main square that was put up and put down each year, and where you could walk through, and there are benches where you could sit on the side of the walkway, so you could look at people that walked through, so which would be see and to be seen. Later on, the authorities stopped charging to get into the Stockholm, and then people start coming because it wasn't fun any longer when anybody could get in. So the last time this happened was around 1896, I think it was, 94, 96. There is an interesting newspaper article written here in 1892. It says, a little part of it says, Mexico gives comfort to all on the Day of the Dead. Some with the privilege of luck, or they who have gone to the pawn shop with all they can, to appear as someone they are not, goes in the carriage to the concert in the Alameda. The other lock themselves up in their houses, and the rest go to the restaurants to ease their feelings, emptying enormous glasses with liquor. So there was quite a party. I forgot to mention one thing from the 18th century. In mid-18th century, there had been evolved a tradition to go to the graveyards on the Day of the Dead. And that became too big. There were too big a party on the graveyards. So in 1766, the authorities did forbid having parties on the graveyard during the Day of the Dead. Now, if we move to then the 20th century, you have seen this is a very well-known painting by Diego Rivera. In the beginning of the 20th century, the indigenista movement, the indigenous movement begins. Intellectuals, painters, writers start to see the indigenous past as the Mexican past. It's again connecting to this glorious indigenous past. Painters use indigenous models, they use indigenous context for paintings, even pre-Hispanics and so on. So the indigenous people and traditions become the Mexican in a way. The director of the museum, National Museum of Art, who helped us quite a bit in this, Miriam Kaiser, said that the first example of this is the painting called La Ofrenda by Saturnino Herrán, that is now in the National Museum of Art. It's worth looking at. Then there comes Diego Rivera and starts to use Posadas imagery in his paintings. Posadas images had not been used in Day of the Dead context earlier at all. He was not involved in indigenous cultures or Day of the Dead or anything. But he started also to set up offerings of a very intellectual character in his studio at the Day of the Dead, and to invite people to a party around that offering. And that is definitely the start of this public kind of offerings that you now see at the main square. We are talking about 1940 something. I think it was, well, this painting is 1948, and it's something around that he started to do these offerings at his studio also in what now the Museum Anna Wakali. So he has had an enormous influence on the Day of the Dead, actually, with regarding the imagery used and the building of this kind of, shall we call it, fine art offerings that then developed into other things also. So that is probably what this Dr. Elsa Malvido refers to in her comment. It was reinvented with Mexican folklore in the 1930s. I suppose that the journalist who wrote down this also could have misunderstood a bit what she said. She must have been aware of what happened in 1800 as well. The Day of the Dead is definitely also affected, influenced by tourism from 1950s and onwards. Tourists want to see this, and people try to fulfill the tourist intentions. 1980, we can probably call, there has happened something we can call the Echeverria effect. The President Echeverria had a lot of interest in promoting Mexican culture, promoting the Day of the Dead and other Mexican feasts. There were more anthropologists and ethnographiers and so on coming out of the schools than ever. Museums were founded and so on and so on. And from 85 on, I think we can talk about the ketchup effect. I mean, here in San Miguel, in the 70s, early 80s, Day of the Dead wasn't visible at all. There were absolutely nothing on the streets. There were a little, some graves in the graveyards were decorated, but it was important in the indigenous communities outside in San Miguel. Guerrero, and what Elon was now out of the western side of La Presa, indigenous communities also within the limits of San Miguel, but not on the public streets and so on. So, if we go to nowadays here, this is San Miguel Allende some 10 years ago, and when you remember what Fray Francisco de Alcofrin said, 1763, that before the Day of the Dead they sell thousands of small sheep of sugar that they call offering. They sell coffins, images of the dead. It's incredible to see the mass of people the night before and under the Day of the Dead. I mean, that's this one. This little market stall here in San Miguel. When it comes to offerings, I'm not sure if you're aware of that the Day of the Dead was declared an intangible cultural heritage of humanity in 2003. We had we're very lucky to got in contact with a person that was putting the information together for that to UNESCO. So we had it available when we were working. That was the director of the Museum of National Art, Miriam Kaiser, who was very helpful in this. And this is actually a drawing of an offering that was included in that package of information delivered to UNESCO. And as you can see here, there is often said that an offering should have different levels, it should be pyramid form, that the levels have a certain meaning, and so on. There should be 7 layers or levels, that means the sky and the underworld and the water. That is something that people have found out lately. Unfortunately, you can hear that from schools and from cultural institutions and so on. This is built on the simple principle that in the home there is normally, as an indigenous home, there is normally a small table with some religious symbols on it. The saint, a couple of crosses, some other decorations. And in front of that, for the Day of the Dead, they put up another table on which they put fruit, food, photos of the dead, water, flowers, and so on. There are no specific rules, but the food is very important, the flowers are important, the cut paper is important. And it often has a kind of arc in the end, and that arc is for the souls to fly in through. They should find the way. That arc shows them where to go. And if we look at how a offering can look at here in San Miguel, during the Day of the Dead, it has about the same content. It's photos of the dead, it's papel picado, there is Coca-Cola, I think, there is the favorite food, favorite drinks, a beer, and so on. And this is the normal Mexican home. And now a bit more spectacular. Now there comes a series of photos of current manifestations of the Day of the Dead. Here in Michoacán, village, this is a village called Cocochucho. I went there in mid-90s or late 90s, and there were only one tourist there. That was an American young guy who has pitched his tent on the graveyard in the corner of the grave. He was an anthropologist or something like that. Now, a couple of years ago, I saw ads in Atención about guided trips to Cocochucho. Actually, when we wrote the book, we did choose not to put the name of the village in order not to get tourists there, but they found it anyhow. This is the same graveyard, about 6 o'clock in the morning, the day after. People had a good time there. They were sitting around the graves, chatting, eating. There were no partying, but they were all the night a slow murmuring of people talking slowly and in low voice. And here about 5, 6 in the morning they were waking up. Very nice people. It was a very, very strong experience to be there during the night. And when they left the graveyard, they left their fruit and their bread they had there at the entrance of the graveyard. And traditionally that food should have been brought to the bell ringer at the church. But nowadays they didn't have a bell ringer, so now they put it on this petate, and then the children, they had one of these, what you call it, they carried that to the school, where they distributed these to the school children. This was also a very strong experience. This is the offering in remembrance of a 17-year-old boy that was killed the year before. He was murdered. And his godfather, according to the traditions in this village, should give him in death the festivities he couldn't give him when he was alive. As he was 17 years old when he died, the next feast the godfather should organize and pay for was his wedding. So around this offering, the family, his grandparents, parents, cousins, sisters, brothers, parents, were sitting around this. But outside the house there was a full wedding party with people, with music, with a priest and food. But he was missing, and there were no bride, of course. And in a region where you don't have much flowers, as here in the very dry area north of Toluca, you decorate the graves with what you have, agaves. A little village called San Bartolo. And in Yucatan, the Day of the Dead in Yucatan is called Hanal Pijan. This is their offering to a dead. It's the father of the woman there dressed in white, and his bones are actually in this cardboard cartoon, say Ariel. There are his bones. They have. Yucatan has a special situation. You have about 2 feet of soil, and then it's a stone ground. So they bury the corpses in coffins very, very ground. And after 2 years, they dig them up and put them in a final sort of recipient to go to another place. I have some photographs of the moment where they dig that up, and I didn't bring these photos. They are in color, and quite a few people would like to see them. But it's a Hanal Pijan. And I don't think we should leave the Day of the Dead before talking a bit about the Mexican handicrafts that are so important in this today, and especially Don Felix Luna from San Miguel, who was a very important historian, an amateur historian, but with an enormous knowledge about the traditions in the indigenous villages and communities in and outside of San Miguel Allende. His father was Otomi Indian and was an important person at that time, and Don Felix learned from him and was always with him on his travels. Unfortunately, Don Felix passed away a bit too early, some 10 years ago. And the Day of the Dead has crossed many borders. This is an offering built in the Museum of Ethnography in Stockholm by Kristina, sitting down there. And there we have these different levels and so on. And you can see some of the footage you've seen on the wall. And this one is quite interesting. This is actually built at British Museum, and it's built by a professional ofrenda builder from a village called Huaquechula in Puebla, where they build enormous offerings of that character. It takes months to build them, and they are very expensive. And you contract a professional builder to do that. But I'll finish here with what I think is maybe the simple little intimate home offering in a small house. How are we with time? You're okay? I can take a couple of more. So I had sort of finished here, but I'll show you. This is an interesting one. This is from Oaxaca, and you can see here how the entrance is built for the souls to find and go into the offering to eat of the food. The belief that the souls have been there is very strong. And it's considered that the food after the Day of the Dead, after it doesn't taste anything any longer. It has lost the taste because the souls came and took the taste. As they are only souls, they can't take the substance, but they take the taste. So we finish there. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Lars. If there are questions, I think we could take a couple of them.
I was wondering if you could tell us what year the human sacrifices were stopped in Mexico?
Which year human sacrifices were stopped?
Yeah, where they...
I don't know really, but I suppose that the conquerors were quite harsh on that point. So I would think that they stopped basically after the conquest. Most probably there were sacrifices later on in isolated villages or communities, but I don't have any specific information on that. There were rumors that has shown the unfounded that two air pilots that crashed in the mountains of Puebla I think it was in 1951, had been sacrificed. They seem to have been clarified now that they were murdered to get their stuff. But I don't know really. But I would think that there could have been examples of that into the early 17th century in remote villages and so on. It's not impossible.
The animated film Coco.
Sorry?
The animated film Coco deals with an ingenious idea of the way the dead can return once a year to their family if certain characteristics hold true for that family. Would you comment on, if you know the film?
No, I haven't seen the film.
What is your projection of the continuance of the more authentic aspects of the Day of the Dead, given the impact of tourism on this ceremony?
I'm not sure if I got it completely. The impact of tourism.
More tourism, say 50 years now, how much of the original
It
tradition?
has had an enormous impact.
Right.
There are places in Michoacan that basically, well, they live off Day of the Dead, such as Canicio and so on. And you can see here in the main square of San Miguel, that is quite a new phenomenon. And there's one I said last time I gave this speech in 2012, that this cultural politics and this commercialism and so on. And then one person, it was actually Austin Briggs, the expert on,
James Joyce.
James Joyce, who said to me, well, have you heard of a tradition that is not initiated by commercial or our commercial needs? And I said, well, probably not. I mean, at some point things start of a reason. And I don't think it just pops up.